Okay, this week we'll be looking at Angular. So what is Angular? So Angular is a front-end model view controller framework, MVC, and it was developed by Google. There's been two major versions of Angular. There was Angular JS, and then what you would be using now, which is just Angular. Angular JS was originally designed to work with JavaScript, thus the name of Angular JS. But as of the second revision, they changed it to now use TypeScript. So the name was changed to just Angular. I think the current version of Angular, as we're doing this video, is Angular 6. Angular 7, I think, is planned for sometime October 2018, something like that. So as I said before, Angular is a front-end JavaScript framework. So it compiles two JavaScript files, which are then loaded into your browser and are run locally. So Angular doesn't run on the server, however it can communicate with the servers through services. Angular is designed to provide a better structure to larger JavaScript projects. Your smaller projects may not have that much of a benefit, that the extra overhead in running Angular might be more than what you're needing, but for a larger project, the structure that it gives it makes it a better option. So Angular presents three main concepts for a front-end development, and we'll look at components, models, and services. So components. So a component is generally something that's visual on the screen, such as a button or a form or a menu or any section of your page. You can think of a component as what goes inside of a div tag along with any associated JavaScript and logic with it. So a component performs the following tasks. So it can create and display HTML and CSS for the component. It handles any events that occur within that component, and it manages any data that might be displayed or entered into via that particular component. So in the world of model view controllers, the model simply means the data. So it can define the structure of the data, its property names, its types. So you can think of a model as, we can use it simply as a class for storing our data. So let's look at services. So services provide us a structured way for us to fetch and save data that can be displayed in a view. This allows us to separate the logic of the getting and setting of the data from its actual presentation. For example, let's say you had a function that checked whether a username or password were correct. That function wouldn't belong to any specific visual component. Instead, it would be a function that is available running in the background. So this would then become the service. So one difference between components and services is that you can have many instances of the same component on the page, but you would only have one instance of a particular service, but it could be accessed by any of the multiple components on that particular page. So we've now established what Angular is. So it's an MVC framework using now, with the latest version, TypeScript. So we can get on to now of actually installing Angular on our machine. The first thing we'd need to do is actually install the Angular command line interface. To do that, we can use the npm install -g for global option at angular/CLI, and that will install the Angular command line interface that we can then use for creating and generating our Angular applications. So if we want to create a new project, so from our command line, we will be using the command we see here, which is the ng with the command of new and the name of our particular application. Another alternative, which we will use in our task this week, would be to use ng new, the name of your app, with an option of routing. This will allow for the automatic generation of a routing module. It saves you having to create that yourself. So let's jump to the command line now, and we'll actually go in and create a Angular application. So I have already installed the Angular command line interface using npm. So now all I need to do to create an app is to do ng new. We'll just call it demo. And I will also, for this purposes, add in the tracking option, which will add our... Okay, we move now to terminal and we will create our Angular application. Now I've already installed via npm the Angular command line interface. So we can start off with an Angular command which starts with ng, and we go new, and I'll call this one demo, and I will add on the routing option for it to automatically create us a routing module. So once we do this, it can take a little bit to happen as it downloads all of the files and sets them up. So it will take a minute or two. We'll just let this roll. If you have access to faster internet, it may happen faster for you. Okay, and we're done. So do an ls command. We can now see that we have a new directory here, which was called demo. So we'll change directories to demo and have a look at the files that we have in there. So I'll jump into Atom now. And we'll have a look through the files that were added in here as part of the process of creating the standard app for us. So here we are in Atom, and I've created added a project folder of demo for where we created our Angular application. So you'll notice that there's lots of files in here. Angular generates a lot of files. The main files that we're interested in will be in this source directory, and in particular the app directory with inside that. But there's some other files in here that are important that we should have a look at first. And we'll look at this one here first, which is the index.html. So this is the root level of the HTML document that is generated to display your application. There's a special tag here that's created, the app root tag, and it designates the location in this document that your Angular app will be rendered into. So we can add in any other metadata, we can link in any other stuff that we would in our head section, but all our app stuff will be loaded into this portion of the body tag. Okay, the next file that we want to look at is this main.ts. TS being for TrueScript. So the main TS file is a TrueScript file through which all of our other files are loaded. We can see that it imports our app module. We'll get to talking about that one in a moment. And it's using that app module to bootstrap the application. Bootstrapping meaning to start, to get it going. So that'll be our entry point to application. So we'll be importing in our app module and then using that as the bootstrap to get going. So looking, what is a module? We talked about this app module, and if we go into our app directory and app module, this is the file here. So an Angular module, it declares a compilation context for a group of components, and modules can import functionality from other components. We'll see here for our app component or our app module that we're currently in, that it's actually importing in some other information. Angular is quite a large language, and we don't want to be downloading or installing all of the language on every page that we want. So whenever we create a page, we're only importing those parts of Angular that we need to make that page actually run. We don't want our files to be super big, otherwise it would take forever for people to load our applications. So in here, by default, we're going to load in a browser module. We're going to load in core information that lets us work with modules. By default, when we created this app, we asked it to create a routing module. We can see our routing modules TS file over here. So we want to import that in so that we have access to it and can use it. And we also want to import in the default component, and which would be coming from this particular file over here, which is the app component TS. And so we're going to be loading that in. The ng module decorator is then giving us information about declarations and imports, and then also which component will be then bootstrapped to be the first component that's actually going to get loaded. We have a couple of other files here that make up our first base component. There is an app.component.css. There is an option when we generate our new application to pick from whether we want our styling to be done via CSS or via Sass. In this case, by default, if we put no extra option in, it will do it via CSS, but there is an option that we can actually generate and do Sass instead of CSS. So the CSS here will be used and is scoped to just this component. The app.component.html file contains the HTML of our component. And we will get onto this later on, that when we're doing our routes, that we create a router outlet tag in here, and then any of our routes get loaded into this particular portion of the page. So we're not reloading the whole page, we're just any of our different routes will then be loaded into one subset of our page. The component specs.ts is used in testing. We won't be looking at that here for the moment. And our app.component. So this file holds metadata about your component and the data and logic needed to manage that component. And the last file we have in here, which we looked at before, which we've mentioned before, is the routing module. So the routing module, this was generated when we used the -- routing option when we created the app. So in here we can list the routes that our app is going to require, and they're listed as objects in this routes array. Let's just go back to our app component.ts and just step through some of the information that's in this particular file. So we'll notice in the component decorator here, we've got an option here for selector. So for this particular app selector is the app root, and you would have noticed back in our index.html file that the tag that was used in here was app root. That name has come from this particular selector in here. And when we want to add a particular component to a page, you'll be injecting it into the page by inserting its selector. It's like it's your own custom HTML tag, which will then reference that particular component. The actual HTML content for that component, we've got a couple of options here. We can use a template URL, which will link to a particular HTML file. We also had the option to just use template, and we can enter in any sort of HTML we want in here to do the exact same thing. It's just a little neater if you can keep all your HTML in its own file rather than creating this component file with some HTML in it. Unless it's a small amount of code that you want to put in, and then that could be fine as well. We also have here a style URLs option where we can pass through an array of files. We might want to have more than one CSS file loaded for that particular component. So here we can see it's loading in the default app component CSS that was automatically created. So that would be there, but we could also add in other CSS files as required for that particular component. And last thing down here, we've got a property of our class that we could then use that through data binding to display in our page. Binding. So data binding allows a link from our model or our data with our view. So the first form of data binding in Angular is interpolation. So to declare a data binding using interpolation, you use the double curly braces notation. So let's just do a quick sample. Instead of using our template URL, we'll just put something in as a template, and we'll do a H1, and we have this property down here that we may want to show, which is part of our model effectively. So we can display our title in our HTML by using this double curly brackets notation. So this is a one-way binding from the data source to the view. If for some way we changed the value in our view, it wouldn't be updated in our title. We do have options for a two-way data binding. And for that, we use a syntax which is termed as banana in a box, as a way of remembering that we have these round curly brace or round braces inside the square braces, and our values would be going inside that. So it's the banana in a box. So this allows two ways so that the view can update the model and the model can update the view as each of them change. We have one other form of data binding, and that's more in event binding. So that allows us to interact with your application, or users will be interacting with your application. And the only way that we know that something's been done is if we listen out for these particular events. So we do this in Angular using event binding. Let's, for example, say we had a form and we wanted to listen for a submit event, and for that particular thing we may want to then call a function. Let me put my quotes in. That would then do something. This function would then be created in our down further here as a method of this particular class, and we could put the logic in that would happen based on what was happening from this particular form elements that we might generate. There are other imports that we would need to do. We would need to bring in a forms module to be able to interact with form data, but we'll look into that when we do the tasks for this week's tutorials. Okay, so the next step we've got to look at is we've got an app here. What do we do with it? How do we run it? So our process for that is we'll come back to our command line, and we want to run a command. Well, if we were going to be distributing this particular app, we'd want to sort of optimize how all our files go together, and we have an option within Angular to run run ng build. This will optimize all our files and will load all of the actual files that we would upload to our website into a directory called dist for distribution. If we come back into here, we'll see that now we've got this extra directory here called distribution. Inside that will be the name of our app, and these are the files that are going to make up our app. So we'll find the index file. Notice there are no TS files now. It's all back to JavaScript files because the output of TrueScript is JavaScript. So that we can then now run our app. So the next step in running our app, there is a convenient option here to create its own web server. while we're in development phases, while we're still using the non-build version. So if we run ng-serve with an option of open, which will then automatically open it in a browser, we can run that. It will spin up a server running on localhost at port 4200. You can see it's reporting that here. Once it's done its build, it should then open the browser at port 4200, and we can see the code that we saw earlier that was in our source app HTML. So this is the text, so welcome to and title, and we saw that the title was app. And if we come back to looking at our code, we said welcome to app. If we went in here and changed that to my next app and saved, and we come in here, the serve option will be in the background updating the server. So you just need to come back and those updates will show as we update our pages.